My husband's childhood girlfriend threw me a fake pregnancy test and told me it was from him.
My name is Janelle, and I never imagined I'd be telling this story, not like this.
I met my husband Miles when I was 22.
He was 25, a calm, thoughtful man who seemed grounded in all the ways I admired. I had recently started a high-stress but rewarding job in financial consulting, while he worked in a modest office role at a logistics company. Despite our differences in income, we found common ground in values, humor, and our shared love for quiet nights in. From the start, Miles made me feel cherished. He brought flowers to our early dates, took me out to local jazz clubs, and even surprised me with thoughtful gifts when I had rough weeks. When he told me he'd never felt this way about anyone else, I believed him. We moved in together after our first year and eventually got married. For 4 years, we lived what felt like a stable and loving life. Things changed subtly when Miles introduced me to someone named Corinne, a woman he referred to as his old family friend. Oddly, he hadn't mentioned her at all during our entire relationship, not even in passing. When I asked why, he shrugged it off, saying they didn't talk much until recently and had reconnected because of a community volunteer project.
I wanted to trust him. I still do. But it felt off. It came out, not from Miles directly, but from accidental slips in his schedule. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him gone, saying he was working late or pulling overtime. Once or twice I believed it. But the third time, I started checking his calendar and noticed some inconsistencies. When I confronted him, he hesitated, then admitted he'd been meeting Corinne at local community events and family-style parties she invited him to. I was shocked, not because I thought he was cheating, but because he had hidden it from me. He insisted their friendship was entirely platonic. To his credit, he gave me full access to their texts. And yes, from what I read, they didn't cross any boundaries, at least not the obvious ones. The messages were casual, sometimes warm, but not romantic. Still, the secrecy hurt. The first time I met Corinne in person, she was incredibly sweet. Polite, welcoming even. She complimented my dress and said Miles was lucky. It calmed me, briefly. I convinced myself that maybe I had overreacted. But things began to spiral quickly. Corinne invited us to her mother's anniversary dinner. Miles was excited about it and said her family had known him since he was a teen. They saw him as one of their own. I felt some hesitation, but I agreed to come. Truthfully, I wanted to find common ground with her. I work long hours, and I was hoping to make a new friend, maybe even get invited to a girls' night or two. On the night of the event, I walked into the house with Miles, and the moment we stepped through the door, Corinne rushed over and wrapped her arms around him, full embrace. Not the kind you give someone you haven't seen in years. It was possessive, if anything. I stood there awkwardly, waiting for him to turn to me or say something. He didn't. She pulled him off into the backyard before we'd even been offered drinks. Left alone, I wandered into the kitchen, where I met Corinne's mother, Lucille. She was delightful, gracious and curious about my work. I appreciated her kindness, and for a while, it felt like the night could still be salvaged. But dinner was a different story. As we gathered around the table, I sat beside Miles. Not 2 minutes later, Corinne approached and asked me to switch seats. I asked, "Is there a reason?" She pointed to her mother and uncle sitting at the other end. "That spot's open." "I just want to sit here," she said, motioning toward Miles. I looked at Miles, expecting him to support me. Instead, he nodded at me and whispered, "Don't make a scene. Just switch." I was stunned. I moved, more out of shock than anything else, and sat beside Lucille. She seemed to notice my discomfort but didn't say much, at least not yet. Meanwhile, Corinne and Miles sat side by side, giggling, leaning into each other during conversation, and exchanging inside jokes I'd never heard before. Every small touch she gave him on the shoulder, his back, his wrist, felt like a new bruise forming under my skin. And then, the final blow, I served myself a piece of roast beef. Corinne glanced at my plate and smirked. "Are you really going to eat all that?" she asked, loud enough for the table to hear. The room went quiet for a beat before she and Miles laughed. I couldn't even look at him. Lucille was the only one to speak up. "That's inappropriate, Corinne," she said. "Treat our guests with kindness." Corinne didn't even flinch. I pushed my chair back, muttered an apology, and left the table. In the guest bathroom, I locked the door and began doing breathing exercises, something my therapist taught me years ago for workplace anxiety. My hands trembled. I messaged my brother, hoping for support, but he told me I was being dramatic. That it was probably just a case of jealousy. I wanted to believe that. I really did. When I returned, I sat silently beside Lucille. She offered a sad smile but didn't press.
I spent the rest of the evening watching them, Miles and Corinne, smile, whisper, and act as though I was no more than a polite guest at a party I never asked to attend. The rest of that dinner felt like walking through a minefield. Every time I looked at Miles, he avoided eye contact. Corinne was in her element, charming everyone at the table, leaning into him during jokes, making subtle jabs that only I seemed to notice. I held back tears through dessert, smiled politely at Lucille, and excused myself as soon as the plates were cleared. Outside, I called my father. I hadn't spoken to him much about my marital concerns. He's always been a quiet, pragmatic man, but the second I heard his voice, I broke down. I told him everything in scattered pieces, how Miles had hidden his friendship with Corinne, how I was treated like a stranger in a room full of people who adored my husband but barely acknowledged me, and how Corinne made me feel like I didn't belong. He was calm, though I could hear the concern underneath. "You can come stay here for a few days," he said. "It doesn't have to mean anything permanent. Just take a breather." I hesitated but eventually accepted. By the time I returned to Corinne's home to tell Miles I was heading out, he wasn't even inside. One of the guests said he'd gone back out to the garden with Corinne. I didn't go looking for him. I just left. Back at my father's house, I took a shower and tried to decompress. But when I checked my phone, my stomach dropped. Dozens of messages from Miles, none apologetic. They were angry, accusing me of ruining the evening and embarrassing him in front of people who meant a lot to him. One message in particular stood out: "I'm staying at Corinne's tonight. You need time to cool off." It wasn't just the betrayal, it was how casually he said it. There were also messages from Corinne. One read, "You've made everyone uncomfortable tonight with your little jealous outbursts. Try not to embarrass yourself next time." Another said, "This whole pick-me behavior doesn't suit you." I had to look up what that even meant. When I did, my chest tightened. It was a term meant to shame women who seek validation by putting down other women. It wasn't who I was. And it wasn't how I had behaved. I'd said nothing to her all night. The next day, Miles came home late in the afternoon. He looked exhausted, as if the night had been a strain on him. He tossed his keys onto the side table and sank into the couch like nothing had happened. I asked him calmly why he thought it was acceptable to spend the night at another woman's house, especially after I left feeling humiliated. His response? "You're overreacting. Again. You always think the worst." We argued. The tension had been simmering for weeks, but now it was boiling over. He accused me of being controlling and jealous. I told him I felt neglected and lied to. He dismissed my emotions, suggesting I needed to see a counselor to deal with my insecurity. After that argument, the silence settled between us like fog. We still lived under the same roof, but he grew distant, colder. His text messages became one-word replies. The affection, the little gestures I had cherished early in our relationship, disappeared. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. Then, a week later, it got worse. That morning, I woke up to a message from Corinne. It was a photo of a positive pregnancy test. Attached was a note that simply read, "I think it's time you and Miles go your separate ways. This belongs to him." My heart pounded in my chest. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure whether it was real, a prank, or something else entirely. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I waited for Miles to come home that evening, hoping he'd bring it up, confess, or even deny it, but he didn't. In fact, he came home later than usual and went straight to the shower without saying a word to me. I sat on our bed, staring at the floor, replaying every conversation, every sign I'd ignored. I thought about the late nights, the way he lit up when Corinne entered a room, how easily he turned against me when she was around. It all clicked in a way that made my chest feel hollow. I sent a message to Miles asking him if he had anything he wanted to tell me. No reply. Hours later, I sent a longer message, telling him I knew about Corinne's text. This time he replied, not with a denial, but with a single sentence that crushed what little hope I had left. "Let's talk tomorrow. I need space tonight." I didn't sleep at all. I kept replaying his tone, the way he avoided the issue, how easily he dismissed my pain. In the morning, I messaged my father again, telling him I might be staying longer than I thought. It was in that fog of despair that I decided to reach out to Corinne's mother, Lucille. I wanted to know how long she had known Miles. Something didn't sit right with the timeline he gave me. She didn't reply immediately, but when she did, it felt like a light flickered in a dark tunnel. She said they had only known Miles for about 2 years, not since childhood, as he had claimed. And more importantly, Lucille told me, he wasn't around much at first. He started visiting often during his supposed overtime. That's how they got close. I closed the message and stared into space for a long time.
My mind swirled with anger, grief, and a strange kind of relief that I hadn't imagined at all. That my instincts had been right. That night, I packed up a few more bags and turned off my phone. I spent the following day numb. The hours passed without meaning. I barely moved from the guest room at my father's house, except to make tea. I didn't drink or check my phone for messages that didn't come. When Miles finally did reach out, it was a simple text: "I think we should meet and talk." Not at the house. Something about his phrasing made me feel like I was the one in the wrong. I didn't reply right away. I was tired of waiting for honesty, of being talked over, of the feeling that I was being erased from my own life. Still, I agreed to meet. Not for reconciliation, but for clarity. We met at a quiet park near our home. It was chilly, overcast, the kind of weather that makes you feel smaller than you are. Miles arrived late, as usual. He gave me a guarded smile, but I didn't return it. He sat on the bench beside me and sighed deeply, as if he were the one carrying the emotional weight. "About Corinne's message," he began. "She jumped the gun." "It's not mine." I blinked. "Then why didn't you say that when I asked?" He shrugged. "I didn't know what to say. I figured you'd just blow up anyway." I stared at him, trying to understand how he could speak so calmly, so casually. Why would she even send something like that if it wasn't true? "She was trying to scare you off," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She thinks you're bad for me." The words cut sharper than he probably realized. "And do you?" He hesitated, then mumbled something about how we haven't been working for a while and that I tend to escalate things. I asked him if he had told Corinne anything about our marriage, things that might make her believe I was some sort of villain. He denied it. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. I left the park more confused than ever. He hadn't clarified anything. If anything, he made it worse. That night, I texted Lucille again. I asked her whether Miles had ever talked about our relationship. She didn't reply right away. Instead, I got a phone call from Corinne herself. She didn't greet me or ask if I had a moment. She launched straight into a tirade. Her voice was sharp, controlled, rehearsed. She accused me of mistreating Miles, said she knew everything about how I treated him during fights, and how she had to step in before I did something worse. I asked her what she was talking about. She told me that, according to Miles, I had hit him. That I'd thrown his belongings out of our bedroom window in a jealous fit. That I had emotionally manipulated him for years. I sat in stunned silence. That wasn't just a distortion, it was fiction. Miles left because I kicked him out, I said slowly, trying not to cry. I never laid a finger on him. I didn't throw anything out. I packed a bag. He left after calling me unstable. Corinne was quiet for a moment. Then, she said something that stayed with me. "He told me you were dangerous," she said. "That you screamed at him all the time. That you kept him from seeing his friends. That you never respected him." "He told you all that?" I asked. She confirmed. "And he said you always knew about me." I could feel my breath shorten. "That's not true." We spoke for almost an hour, her tone shifting slowly from defensive to uncertain. I didn't yell or accuse her. I just told the truth, how I hadn't even known Corinne existed until a few months ago. How Miles had never mentioned her once in 4 years. How the late nights were justified with lies. How the overtime was just hours spent at her house. Finally, she admitted something that shook me even more. "I only started liking him platonically," she said. "I thought he was going through a hard time with a difficult partner. But then, he tried something." "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "A couple of weeks ago, when he stayed over, he made a move. He tried to kiss me. I told him no. He said I'd come around." There was silence between us for a long moment. "I believed him when he said he was hurting," she added quietly. "But now I'm not so sure." Corinne didn't apologize. Not directly. But she did say she was sorry for letting things go so far. For sending that message. For being so involved. She also said she would talk to her mother, who had blocked me earlier, after hearing Miles's version of events. I thanked her and ended the call. And then, for the first time in days, I cried not out of confusion or despair, but out of release. The person I thought I had built a life with had fabricated an entire narrative to justify his actions. He had painted me as abusive, volatile, unstable, also he could have a backup plan if things fell apart. And he had convinced someone intelligent, articulate, and skeptical to believe it. I sat in my father's living room, my phone on my lap, the conversation playing over and over in my head. I no longer wanted answers. I no longer needed closure. I just wanted out. Later that night, Miles texted me again. This time, he sounded different. Less defensive. More uncertain. I'm sorry, he wrote. I think I messed things up. Can we meet again? I need to explain. I didn't reply. Instead, I began organizing the documents I needed for a legal consultation. The illusion was over. And I was done being the villain in someone else's lie. I didn't sleep much after my call with Corinne. Not because I was sad anymore, but because the reality had finally crystallized. The man I married wasn't just emotionally unavailable. He had lied to everyone around us about me, about himself, and about the fragile life we had tried to build together. The next morning, I reached out to a family friend who worked in a local law office. She wasn't a divorce lawyer, but she helped me get in contact with one. I scheduled a consultation for later that week and began collecting anything I thought might be relevant: text messages, call logs, screenshots of the pregnancy test photo, and Corinne's admissions. That same morning, I received another message from Miles. Please, let's just talk. I don't want to lose you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have words. But because I finally knew the truth: he didn't want me back, he just didn't want to be left behind. That afternoon, Lucille, Corinne's mother, messaged me. She had spoken to Corinne and said she believed my side now. She told me that Miles had repeated the same story to her, that I was controlling, that I had cut him off from the world, that he was trapped. But she also said Corinne had admitted she'd never once seen Miles afraid of me, and that something had always felt off. Lucille apologized for believing him. She told me that, had she known the full story, she never would have let her daughter be so involved in our lives. I appreciated her honesty. It was one of the few moments in this experience where someone took accountability without being asked. That evening, Corinne messaged one last time. She said she had blocked Miles and that she was sorry for what she had contributed to. She still didn't excuse everything, but she acknowledged that she had let her assumptions cloud her judgment. She also confirmed that the pregnancy test she sent me wasn't even hers, it was a photo taken from a friend's prank years ago, something she'd hoped would push me over the edge so Miles would finally leave. I sat with that for a while, how close I had come to unraveling over a staged lie. I thought back to all the signs I had brushed aside: the quiet defensiveness, the late nights, the subtle dismissal of my emotions, the way he'd turned things around when I tried to talk about my needs. I remembered when I used to excuse those behaviors as stress, as poor communication, as anything but what they really were: emotional manipulation. When I finally called Miles, it was not for reconciliation, but for closure. He answered on the second ring, sounding breathless, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. I'm calling to let you know, I said, I'm filing for divorce. This isn't working. It hasn't been for a long time. He was quiet. Then, a soft, is there really no way to fix this? There was, I said. But that was before the lies. Before you made me into someone I'm not. He didn't fight back. Maybe he was too tired. Or maybe he knew the truth, too. I never meant to hurt you, he said at last. I believe that, I replied. But it doesn't change what you did. We ended the call there. No yelling. No name calling. Just the soft closing of a chapter that had long stopped being written by both of us. In the weeks that followed, I moved out of our shared home and began the legal process. It wasn't dramatic, just slow, heavy, and filled with paperwork. The house had always been mine anyway, we'd bought it using a loan I qualified for through my job, and the title was in my name. So I stayed. He moved in with a friend temporarily. I took time off work, not much, just a few days to breathe. I walked through the neighborhood in the mornings, spent time with my father in the evenings, and began journaling again. I hadn't done that since college. It helped me sort through the chaos, to put the betrayal into something I could read back and say, I survived this. I also found a therapist. Not because I believed I was broken, but because I wanted to talk to someone who could help me rebuild. Not into the woman Miles thought I was, but into the woman I had always been before I bent myself to fit into someone else's story. Corinne and I didn't keep in touch. I didn't need her forgiveness, and she didn't ask for mine. But I believe she was a victim, too, just in a different way. We were both misled. We both deserved better. The hardest part wasn't losing Miles. It was grieving the person I thought he was. But grief is a process. And every day, I get a little closer to peace. Final note, to those of you who read this and felt seen, thank you. And if you're in something that doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. You're not too sensitive. You're not overreacting. And you deserve a life that doesn't ask you to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. You deserve truth. You deserve freedom. You deserve love that doesn't ask for proof you're worth it. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.